Pleasure to welcome you here today for a discussion of Greg Polling's important new book, On Dangerous Ground, America's Century in the South China Sea. I'm very grateful that all of you waited for this to start while Amtrak had some trouble getting Greg here. Greg is one of the leading authorities on the South China Sea. He is the director of the Southeast Asia program and the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. And joining us today in the discussion, we have two of the country's leading China scholars who need no introduction to a Columbia audience. Andrew Nathan, the class of 1919 professor of political science, and Tom Christensen, the James T. Shotwell professor of international relations and the director of the China and the World program today. They'll help kick off the discussion after Greg makes his presentation. However, before I turn the floor over to Greg, I just want to emphasize what an important contribution this book makes to our understanding of the development of the complex disputes in the South China Sea and the U.S. interests in them. In a more thorough manner than any book that I have read, it analyzes the evolution of U.S. interests over more than a century as the conflicts in the South China Sea evolved from disputes over territory, rocks, islands, shoals, to very hotly contested disputes over rights to exploit resources such as fish and hydrocarbons within the water, as well as disputes over passage through the waters and the airspace over them. And the book illustrates how the U.S.'s interest in freedom of navigation and commitment to its allies, particularly the Philippines, repeatedly drew the U.S. into these disputes, and how those interests today are increasingly challenged by China, which, as we all know, has built and militarized artificial islands, emerged as a major naval power, and today uses that power to harass U.S. allies and partners as they attempt to exploit their rights granted under UNCLOS to fisheries, oil and gas, and more broadly, to exert control over the sea. To date, the United States has been unable to dissuade China from taking further actions, leading many to ask whether the U.S. has in fact lost the South China Sea. A key question that Greg addresses in the book, and one I'm not going to give the answer to right now. But I also want to emphasize that the book is much more than a story of U.S. interests and policy towards the South China Sea. It's also, as I indicated earlier, a history of the evolution of maritime law over time. It has a fascinating discussion of the process of negotiating UNCLOS, which Greg rightly notes is one of the most ambitious treaties ever negotiated. It's also a fantastic case study of the U.S.-Filipino alliance, an asymmetrical alliance that's been replete with fears of abandonment and entrapment over the years, and that has almost broken down many, many a time. And it's also a study in strategic choices. At critical junctures in the book, Greg critiques policy decisions, particularly of the U.S., but also of other actors, to illustrate how often U.S. policy was reactionary and tactical, particularly during crises, rather than long-term and strategic, and how at various points, different decisions could have deterred China's assertiveness and might have produced better and different outcomes. The book argues that that approach is no longer viable today and concludes with a series of alternative futures for the South China Sea and policy recommendations that the U.S. might adopt in the hopes of preventing China from further undermining the UN Law of the Sea-based maritime order that protects U.S. interest in the freedom of the seas. So In short, it's a fascinating book. I am now going to turn the table over to Greg. He is going to speak for about 20-30 minutes, after which we'll have some Q&A. For those of you joining us at home, please put your questions in the box. Thank you. Greg.
All right, well, thank you, Anne-Marie. Should I pull this a little closer?
Sure.
Okay there?
Yep.
So, well, first off, thank Anne-Marie and all of you for being here, and Julie and the team for making this possible. And thank you to Amtrak for showing me exactly what the train yard in Philadelphia looks like for over an hour. So Anne-Marie's given a too kind summation of the book. Let me start sharing screen for those who are online, and there we go. So I opened the book with a question, and this is the same question that kind of was in the initial proposal for the book, which was, has the United States and its like-minded partners and allies lost the South China Sea? And at the risk of spoilers, I'll tell you the last two sentences of the book are the U.S. has not lost the South China Sea, but it is losing. The real crux of the book, though, is what exactly does any of that mean? What is there for the U.S. to win or lose disputes over rocks and reefs half a world away? And I think the best way, the way that I went about answering that was to look at what historically has drawn the U.S. to the South China Sea, because there has been a remarkable consistency in U.S. talking points and interests for the better part of a century, at least. They have not always been top of mind. In fact, they really weren't. And the South China Sea has undoubtedly elevated in importance for the U.S. and its allies in Asia. But the reasons that it cares today are largely the same reasons it cared in the 1990s, the reasons that it cared in the 1970s, even in some ways, the reasons it cared in the 1930s. There are really two U.S. interests here. One is, as Anne-Marie indicated, the interest in alliances. And for many decades, it wasn't just the Philippines, but it has especially been the Philippines. You cannot maintain the U.S.-Philippine alliance without a credible U.S. commitment to defend Philippine interests and lives in the South China Sea. And so goes the South China Sea, so goes the alliance. As long as the U.S. considers the latter important, it is committed to involvement in the former. The second interest is an even older interest. It's an interest in upholding freedom of the seas, which is broader than freedom of navigation, but includes freedom of navigation. And the U.S. was born as a maritime trading republic. It built the very first act that the new Congress passed, essentially, was funding the creation of the U.S. Navy. The first U.S. expeditionary operations abroad, whether you want to look at the two wars against the Barbary States, the entry into the War of 1812, involved concerns about maritime rights, that the U.S. was willing to really go to the mat for the freedom of U.S. merchants, in particular, to operate on the high seas. And the reason the U.S. became a Pacific power in the first place was largely to defend the interests of U.S. merchants, missionaries in East Asia, so that they didn't have to rely on the British anymore. The South China Sea was not really about freedom of the seas for most of the time period I talk about in the book, but it is almost entirely about freedom of the seas today. So for most of the time period covered in the book, nobody was claiming the waters. There was nothing to object to. The claims were wholly limited to rocks and reefs, and therefore the only U.S. concern really was credibility to its allies. By the 1990s, that began to radically change as Chinese claims expanded to include waters, airspace, and seabed. And today, it's quite clear that while the U.S.-Philippine alliance remains an anchor of U.S. interest in the South China Sea, the broader concern is about the rules themselves, that Chinese claims in the South China Sea are anathema to the entire regime represented by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And the book proceeds generally chronologically, but there are kind of two breakout chapters, Anne-Marie indicated, on the development of UNCLOS, because I don't think you can tell the story of why the U.S. involved in the South China Sea without telling the story of why the U.S. cares about the laws as written. Even though the U.S., of course, famously is not a party to UNCLOS. The U.S. was there in the room for the entire decade of negotiations and has baked in these freedoms as matters of customary international law. So before I actually dive into the narrative, let's orient ourselves. When we talk about the South China Sea, we're talking about two different kinds of disputes. We have a maritime dispute over water, seabed, and airspace, represented here by China's famous 9-dash line, but that is a relative latecomer to the disputes. The second set of disputes, the older set, is a territorial dispute over sovereignty, over what China now calls the Sisha, the 4 island groups. They were not historically thought of as coherent groups, but in any case, it's a useful way to frame it. So you have Pratas Island, which is part of Pratas Reef, up off the coast of China, claimed today by China and Taiwan. You have the Paracel Islands, the smaller of the 2 big groups, which is today claimed by Vietnam, China, and Taiwan. Scarborough Shoal or Scarborough Reef off the coast of Luzon, claimed by the Philippines, China, and Taiwan. And you have the Spratly Islands claimed by essentially everybody. In whole, claimed by China, Taiwan, Vietnam. In part, claimed by the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei. Indonesia is also relevant here when it comes to the maritime dispute, but is not a claimant to any of the actual islands. The disputes, as we currently think of them, are roughly a century old. I mean, there is no record of human settlement on any of these islands prior to the 20th century. There is no formal claim or active administration by any claimant prior to about 1816, which is when the Nguyen dynasty in Vietnam formally annexed the Paracels. But that was quickly forgotten. Modern claims date essentially to the period between 1907 and 1909. So to set the scene, in 1895, we had the end of the Sino-Japanese War. The Treaty of Shimonoseki makes Japan the colonial power in Taiwan, which places Japan on the edge of the South China Sea. At the same time, we have the solidification of colonial power by the French in Indochina, by the British down in Malaya and Singapore, and by the Americans after 1898 in the Philippines. And technological revolutions make a thing called guano really important. Guano was the oil race of its day. So you start getting Japanese, French, and Chinese interest in the islands, largely to mine them for bird food, to be used in agricultural fertilizer. The Japanese private businessmen set up an operation on Pratas Island in 1907, which comes to the attention of Chinese authorities in Canton, who object. Eventually, they orchestrate a boycott of Japanese goods, largely driven without involvement by the Qing authorities in Beijing, which eventually leads the Japanese to formally recognize Chinese sovereignty, then Qing dynasty sovereignty, over Pratas Island in exchange for a payment to the private Japanese businessman. That's the first ever record of a territorial dispute over any of the Spratly Islands, and the first formal claim of sovereignty made. At the same time, in 1909, a Chinese admiral by the name of Li Jun, who had been involved in the Pratas dispute, realized, he caught word from local fishermen in Hainan, that there was this other island group called the Paracels. So he orchestrates a sail down to the Paracels, they set up some sovereignty seals, and they formally annex the Paracels on behalf. That is the second act of sovereignty in the modern history of the disputes. Then the Qing dynasty collapses, China falls into warlordism and civil war, and everybody forgets about all of this until the French and the Japanese start popping around the Paracels again, mostly mining for guano and phosphorus. That raises the of the officials in the then Republic of China in 1920, and you get the first kind of modern iteration of these disputes, where Japan, France, on behalf of their client state in Annam, and the ROC are all making claims to the Paracels. And the position of the US government and the UK government is, we don't care. We take no position. Why would we care? In fact, US government documents at the time very clearly say that sailors should beware. The ROC has annexed these islands. The US doesn't recognize anybody's sovereignty. It's for the claimants to decide. At this point, there are still no claims being made to Scarborough Shoal or the Spratly Islands because they're way too far away. Nobody cares. The only interest in the Spratlys, other than local fishermen, is that the US Navy has begun to show some interest in some of the reefs because they lie just off the coast of the Philippines, the American territory of the Philippines at the time. The first formal claim to the Spratly Islands is made by France. France first claims that it's annexing the Spratlys in 1930, but it doesn't specify what exactly that means. It just draws a box around an area of ocean and says, we claim all these islands. To which the UK and the US say, whoa, that's not the way this works. You have to tell us exactly what you're annexing. So in 1933, Paris comes back and provides a list of 7 islands. These 7 islands, all the biggest 7 islands in the Spratlys. This is the first formal annexation by a central government of the Spratly Islands. The Republic of China at this time considers issuing an objection, mostly because it believes that France has just re-annexed the Paracels. When it realizes that these are actually a whole different island group, the Republic of China government makes a formal decision not to object to the French claim. There is no formal Chinese objection to the French annexation of the Spratlys, nor is there any counterclaim. This also leads the Commonwealth authorities in the Philippines, still under US control, but running their own internal affairs after 1935, to start making their own claims. In particular, they say that they are going to someday make a claim to these islands, which they call Las Corrales, but for the time being, they want to solidify control of Scarborough Shoal. Scarborough Shoal is that other piece of land stuck up in the middle of nowhere, essentially an underwater reef. It had been included on maps of the Philippine Islands by both the Spanish and the Americans, but nobody had used it for anything. In 1935, 1937, Philippine authorities go to the Americans and they say, hey, we'd like to set up a lighthouse, an aid to navigation on the island. Is that okay? The US Departments of War and Departments of State both send a letter back to the Commonwealth government that says, yeah, as far as we're concerned, this belongs to the US and therefore is part of the Commonwealth of the Philippines and will become part of the independent Republic of the Philippines upon independence, then scheduled for 1945. All of this becomes academic with the start of World War II in 1941. Japan very quickly breaks the back of Allied naval power in the Pacific and turns the South China Sea into a Japanese lake for effectively 2.5 years. After the war, everybody has bigger concerns. There is a race to reoccupy the islands by a couple of the claimants, though. The French are shockingly slow to reassert sovereignty over the islands that they had annexed, mostly because they're busy dealing with the insurgency by Ho Chi Minh's communist forces in Vietnam. So in the meantime, the Republic of China gets to on them. In December of 1946 and in January of 1947, Republic of China forces board US-donated LSTs, old tank landing ships, sail down to both Woody Island in the Paracels and Ituaba in the Spratlys, which are the 2 biggest, one in each island group, and take a claim. Now, the Paracels, they are reasserting a claim that they have made first as inheritors of the Qing claim of 1909 and then their own right in the 1920s. That's clear. In the Spratlys, this is the first formal claim by any Chinese government to sovereignty over the Spratly Islands, and the first time a Chinese official has ever set foot in the Spratly Islands. It is so contentious, in fact, that the admiral who led the operation went back to Beijing, and in the debates around what their formal claim should be, he said, we shouldn't claim the Spratlys at all. They're too far, they have no economic value to us, we should reassert the old Qing claim to the Paracels. He is overruled. And so in 1947, China makes the first formal claim to all of what it was then saying was 135 islands in the South China Sea. This is the famous declaration by Chiang's government that includes what was then called the U-shaped line. The French do finally wake up. They decide to go out and try to reassert their sovereignty. They don't do much in the Spratlys. They do try to retake Woody Island, but they find all of these Chinese soldiers already there. So what do? They ask the Chinese pretty please to leave. China says no. So the French go off and they set up separate bases on the other side of the Paracels. The Paracels are divided in 2. We have what's called the Crescent Group in the west and the Amphitrite Group in the east. I know the one in the west actually looks more like a crescent, but I didn't name them. They're named, as in most cases, they are named for either the French or British ships who wrecked on them in the first place. And eventually, the Republic of China forces will leave when they lose the Civil War. In particular, they leave in 1951 when Hainan falls, and they can't keep the garrison recent. And they're replaced in 1955 by PRC forces. The French will eventually leave, handing over sovereignty to first their client state of Vietnam, and then eventually the independent Republic of Vietnam in the south. That is how the Paracels will be divided for the entirety of the post-war period until 1974. Down in the Spratlys, as I said, the Republic of China gets down there, they raise a flag on Ituaba, and then they begin to intermittently occupy Ituaba from 1947 until 1951. When again, they have to leave. When they lose the Civil War and Hainan falls, they have no naval power left, they can't resupply this garrison, they pull all their troops out of the South China Sea. The Spratly Islands are left unoccupied from 1951 until 1956. Now, it's also important that in 1951, we have the conclusion of the San Francisco Peace Conference. And one would think that the ultimate sovereignty of the Spratly and Paracel Islands would have been debated in the San Francisco Peace Conference. It received almost no mention. There's a few reasons for that. One, neither the ROC nor the PRC were there because nobody could agree who represented China. Two, the Philippine government knew it wouldn't get American support for a claim, so it kept one. So the only formal claims made during the San Francisco Peace Conference are by the client state of Vietnam, who the French allow to make their own claim to the Paracels and Spratlys. The Soviet representative does push a PRC claim, but it's basically shouted down. And so as a result, the San Francisco Peace Treaty says that Japan gives up all claims to all, does not say to whom. A year later, Japan signs a separate peace accord, the Treaty of Taipei, with the ROC, in which it again kind of waffles. It clearly is a bilateral treaty, and the ROC reads it as being a recognition of ROC sovereignty. But then the Japanese send letters to the French and Vietnamese right afterwards to say, don't worry, this doesn't change this thing. We're not recognizing ROC sovereignty. So the whole thing is left a mess. And you can't blame the participants in the peace conference with the Cold War heating up for thinking that they had bigger fish to fry than a couple of unoccupied reefs and rocks that nobody had ever occupied in the history of mankind. But it did plant the seeds for modern day disputes. Now, the reason that the islands got occupied in 1956 is a fun story involving a bunch of both American and Philippine con men out to make a buck, who you might famously know claimed, in the case of the Filipino, Tomas Cuoma claimed the islands as freedom land. I'm going to skip over all of that because I want you to buy the book. But what it does do is it gets the ROC to come back in and reoccupy the islands. So in 56, in reaction to all this kind of Filipino adventurism by a private individual, ROC sails down and reoccupies Ituaba. The Republic of Vietnam begins regular naval patrols and sets up sovereignty markers at all of those other islands that the French claimed back in 33, but it holds off on occupying them. Philippines makes some objections, but again, doesn't permanently occupy anything. Now, it's not until 1968, with a UN report that suggests that the islands might have a whole lot of oil and gas around them, that suddenly the Republic of Vietnam and the Republic of the Philippines think it's time to occupy the island. Now, Chinese sources generally say that this is the start of the disputes, that up until 1968, no Southeast Asian claimant had objected to any Chinese claims or made any claims of their own. That is not true. Vietnamese claims in the Paracels are older than Chinese claims. Philippine claims in the Spratlys are older than Chinese claims. It is true that nobody in South Asia chose to occupy the islands until after there was oil and gas to potentially be tapped. Why did they hold off? Well, partially because of limited resources, and partially because if you look at this map of what the eventual occupation will be within 5 years of the discovery of oil and gas, all three of those parties are U.S. treaty allies at the moment. The American government has no interest, when all three of these parties are physically fighting in Vietnam, has no interest in seeing its allies shoot each other over a bunch of unoccupied rocks and reefs. So there has been enormous pressure put on both the Philippines and Vietnam ever since 56 to keep their objections on paper, to not pick a fight with each other. And the US position at this time, understandably, is strict neutrality. It is not clear what its Article 5 commitments to the ROC and the Republic of the Philippines would mean, or there's not exactly an Article 5 commitment, but under the Manila Pact to South Vietnam, should there be violence in the Spratlys. This is what I would call kind of the second period of the South China Sea. So the first is the pre-World War II birth. The second is this convoluted tic-tac-toe game of occupation, during which the primary American interest is neutrality. That shifts in 1974. In 1974 is when the PRC really enters the game. Excuse me. So, in 1974, the government in Beijing decides that it finally has both the capability, a very limited naval and coast guard capability, and a bigger militia capability, and the political space to occupy the rest of the Paracels. Remember, it's 1974. Really, the operation starts getting planned in 1973. The Americans have basically pulled out of Vietnam already. Case Church Amendment makes it all but impossible for the U.S. Congress to provide additional military support to the Republic of Vietnam. The doctrine has made clear that the US is not going to seek involvement on behalf of its allies in kind of secondary disputes. And the primary interest of the Nixon government and the Ford government in Asia at this time is the normalization of ties with the PRC. And Beijing evaluates that if it can keep this quiet and quick, it will be able to get away with it, that there will not be American blowback. And it's right. In January of 1974, the PRC picks a fight. It sends out both fishermen, legitimate, and militia, who are not, to go out and begin to occupy some of the reefs around the Vietnamese-held islands on the western half of the Paracels. When the Republic of Vietnam Navy comes out to investigate, a fight ensues. Again, there's a blow-by-blow in the book. It ends with the PRC in control of all of the islands, and nearly 100 ARVN soldiers captured and taken back to China, and one American, who was a military advisor to the government of Saigon. And then you look at the minutes of the Washington Action Committee, Washington Action Group meetings headed by Henry Kissinger. And what's clear is they play exactly the China script. First, they blame the Vietnamese for picking a fight because Kissinger, just in disbelief at the idea that the PRC would have started this. Because why would they? These islands don't matter. And clearly China must care about normalization with the US as much as the US cares about normalization with China. And so he goes to the Chinese de facto ambassador, because we don't yet have formal relations, and he basically says, we're not taking the side of Saigon in this. We just want our guy back. And that is the only US negotiating point for the entirety of the post-Paracel battle crisis. It's not until the American, former Green Beret named Gerald Koch, is released and provides his after-action report, does he confirm that China started the whole thing and that the ARVN was the victim. But by then it's too late. The embarrassment is soon forgotten because Saigon falls less than a year later, and that is the big blow to American credibility, not the failure to intervene in the Paracels. Now this begins what I call phase 3. This is the more modern phase of the dispute as far as US interests are concerned, because in the wake of the Battle of the Paracels and the fall of Saigon, the government of the Philippines knows that it's the last ally standing, or at least it soon will be, because it knows that the ROC treaty is going to be abrogated in 1979. So the Marcos government comes to the US government and it says, as a condition upon renewing US base in the Philippines, along with a bunch of money, you must declare that the Mutual Defense Treaty, Articles 4 and 5 of the MDT, apply in the South China Sea. That conversation begins almost immediately of the Paracels in 74. And it continues until 1979, when the US State Department, under Cyrus Vance, sends a letter to Manila effectively saying exactly that. The public letter says that an attack on Philippine forces need not happen within the metropolitan Philippines to be covered by the treaty. The unspoken part, the part that's in internal State Department wires, is that the legal affairs team and the East Asia Bureau have come to a consensus that any attack on Philippine vessels or any vessels flying the Philippine flag would trigger mutual defense treaty obligations, which is particularly important because Marcos is smart enough that he started drilling for oil and gas in 76, and he made sure he only contracted Americans to do it. So if anybody gets killed, it's going to be Americans alongside Filipinos. The other part of the consensus is that the US remains neutral on sovereignty and is not yet prepared to say whether or not it would defend on the islands themselves. Because it's still only 1976, it's not that long ago, that the Filipinos were the first ones to go out and start occupying new islands in 1970. And the State Department doesn't trust that Marcos won't use this as an excuse to go occupy some more islands and then call on the Americans if the Chinese respond. So from 79 on, the overwhelming US interest in the South China Sea is trying to keep the Philippines in check while still ensuring that it will defend Filipinos who are attacked. This part. This holds as the primary US interest until the end of the 1980s. A lot of things happen that makes the South China Sea fade from the headlines, not least being the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, Chinese invasion of Vietnam in 79, and the US-China normalization. But beneath that, China is engaged in a massive naval modernization campaign. One of the 4 modernizations that Deng Xiaoping announces in 79 is military modernization. A huge part of that is devoting more resources to building up the Chinese Navy, the Chinese Coast Guard, Chinese ocean surveillance fleet, and the Chinese fishing fleet. all of which are kind of encapsulated in a new naval strategy released in 1984 that's variously translated as active offshore defense, among other things. By 87, the PRC decides, much as it did in 73 in the Paracels, that it now has the physical capabilities to occupy some of the Spratlys for the first time. And it again calculates that it has the space to do it as long as it can do it quickly, quietly, and only pick on the Vietnamese.
Greg, I want to ask, what is meant by occupation? Is it people living there?
Physically building something on it permanently, right? So it's landing and raising a sovereignty marker like the Vietnamese have often done. It's not, yeah, well, living without outside support? No, I mean, it means people physically living, yes. And in most cases, in fact, in every case except one, it means military personnel. I mean, the only place civilians live in the South China Sea is on Titu Island, the main Philippine island. The ROC contingent on Ituava now is technically Coast Guard, but their Coast Guard was pretty big guns. So basically, occupation means building a permanent military outpost that is going to be permanent garrison. So in 1987, recognizing that the Vietnamese are international pariahs, even their Soviet friends aren't going to go to the mat for them, China begins to quietly survey reefs and rocks around the Vietnamese-held kind of half of the Spratlys, which is all the stuff down in the southwest, as far as possible away from the Filipinos and the ROC forces as possible. The Vietnamese know something's up, so they begin to also try to expand their holdings. And the first actual Chinese facility is built in December of 87 at Fiery Cross Reef. I'm sorry, January 8th at Fiery Cross Reef. And that begins kind of this game of checkers. China occupies an island, Vietnam occupies an island. China occupies an island, Vietnam occupies an island. More than half of the currently occupied features in the South China Sea, which there are, let me see, 49, depending on how you count, in the Spratlys. More than half of them were occupied in a 3-month span in early 1988 as the Vietnamese tried to race China to occupy everything that was worth having. And by worth having, I mean everything where there's even a speck of dry land. In some cases, they occupied a lot of stuff where there is no dry land. This concluded in March of 1988 when Vietnamese and Chinese forces got to one of the reefs, Johnson Reef, at essentially the same time. Vietnamese waded onto the reef about 2 hours ahead of the Chinese forces. They didn't have any time to dig in. When the Chinese got there, the Vietnamese managed to drive them off, and then the Chinese gunships opened up. They gunned down 66 Vietnamese. They obliterated basically what were the last 2 capable ships of the Vietnamese Navy at the time, and then they were free to occupy everything. So by 88, China has taken 6 islands in the Spratlys for the first time, and it has made clear that it's willing to use force to do this. This is really the last moment when the South China Sea is just about territory, because it's almost immediately upon this that Chinese claims begin to shift. By 1989, China is formally claiming and subsidizing fishing rights all the way off the coast of Indonesia, 1,000 miles from the Chinese coast. By the early 90s, both Chinese and Taiwanese academics are formally kicking around this idea of historic rights, that China should make the old U-shaped line something more than just a claim to territory. By 92, China's for the first time issuing its own oil and gas blocks, 800 or more miles from the Chinese coast, without any rationale based on the islands, right? At no point does China say we're claiming this because of the continental shelf from the Spratlys. China says we're claiming it because it's inside the 9-dash line. In 94, they issue a fishing map that perfectly traces the 9-dash line, saying here's China's historic fishing grounds. In 96, they close off the Paracels, drawing straight baselines around the islands. Within those baselines, they say these are Chinese internal waters, no different than the Bohai Bay or the Yangtze River. Nobody can sail through the Paracels without China's permission, in gross violation of international law. At this time, you have a whole lot of diplomacy going on, finally, between ASEAN and China that will eventually lead to the very ineffective 2002 DOC, which again, I won't get into, read the book. But it also leads to the very first clear statement of U.S. interest in the South China Sea. Shortly after China occupies an underwater reef, Mischief Reef, in the Philippine EEZ, in clear violation of international law, the State Department is asked about the South China Sea. And the State Department spokesperson, in I think it was May of 1995, says that while the U.S. remains neutral on sovereignty, it will take very seriously any claims made by China or anybody else in violation of international law, or that would seek to violate the rights of third parties, because freedom of, at the time I think they said freedom of navigation is a vital interest of the United States. That is almost exactly the talking point that Hillary Clinton would deliver 15 years later at the ASEAN Regional Forum in Hanoi, which again is when the official Chinese historiography says the Americans first showed some interest in the South China Sea. The concern for the Americans was always, yes, neutrality, but also we are neutral on sovereignty, but claims have to be made within a certain framework, and they absolutely must not violate the rights of third parties, meaning the right of the Americans to sail through, but also the rights of everybody else to do what international law says you can do in international waters. This all leads to the very last round of occupations. Mostly the Malaysians shore up their stuff. Also, you have, as I mentioned, mischief, and then in response, the Filipinos occupy Second Common Shoal, which if you've ever seen a photo, when I say occupy, I mean the Filipinos purposely rammed a World War II era ship onto it and then filled it with concrete and said it's an outpost. That is the last thing occupied in the South China Sea in 1999. All of this goes to bed a little bit in the early aughts because everybody has bigger concerns, and the 2002 deal works a little bit. And then in 2009, a more, let's say, ambitious and risk-tolerant China submits the 9-dash line to a UN body, the Commission on Limits of the Continental Shelf, for the first time, provoking a firestorm of criticism, not just from the Filipinos and Vietnamese, but from the Malaysians, from the Indonesians, even from Brunei for the first time. In 2012, China will seize Scarborough Shoal in a story that's probably familiar to most, and the Philippines will file a landmark arbitration case in 2013 against China. China will partially respond to that arbitration by engaging in this historic island building campaign, which again, I'm sure you're familiar with. I won't belabor what they built on the islands. Suffice to say, they're big and they're well armed, and they've radically altered the status quo in the South China Sea. In 2016, the Philippines will win its arbitration case, reaffirming what everybody already knew, that none of these are actually islands. They're rocks and they're reefs, and nobody in human history ever lived on them. And therefore, they are not entitled to full exclusive economic zones or continental shelves. You cannot treat them the way you treat the coast of the Philippines or the coast of Vietnam. China ignores the arbitration, quite famously, and continues to harass essentially all peacetime activity in the South China Sea. And where we stand today is something like this map. China now regularly flies aerial patrols off of the islands. China's forward base in the South China Sea is essentially 1,000 miles south of the coast of China. China maintains at least a dozen coast vessels patrolling every inch of the 9-dash line every single day. China has blocked every single new oil and gas operation by any Southeast Asian claimant within the 9-dash line for at least the last 4 years. And its fishermen are increasingly making life so difficult for Filipino and Vietnamese fishers that they're giving up their livelihoods. So even as the US continues to fly, sail, and operate, in the famous words of the late Ash Carter, it does not help Filipino fishers or Vietnamese oil and gas operators or Malaysian law enforcement vessels, all of whom are increasingly being pushed out of their own waters in a way that I think the US recognizes fundamentally undermines the freedom of the seas. If the freedom of the seas in the South China Sea only applies to the US Navy, then that doesn't really help anybody. And I'm going to wrap up there and welcome any questions. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that broad historic frame. I have a lot of questions, but given that we got started late, I'm going to turn it over to Andy and Tom and let them have their responses or questions first. And those of you online, please submit yours virtually. Thanks.
So they submit to the Q&A box? Or
Yes, but there's nobody there yet.
Okay. Let me ask two questions. So one is that with respect to the American insistence on freedom of navigation as a principle of international law, as you pointed out, it has its historic origin in the fact that the US was a maritime power and it wants to be able to navigate around Iran and around many other countries. But on the South China Sea, I wonder whether my view has always been that both for the United States and for China, though there are many important interests involved, the most important one for both of them is that if there's a war over Taiwan, the South China Sea will be Thanks, Julie, will be
Thank you,
a
Julie.
battle space around Taiwan. So I don't know if you would agree with that and whether that fits into your narrative as you know, the prospect of a US-China battle over Taiwan became more realistic as the Chinese Navy built up and as Taiwan moved away from the possibility of peaceful reunification, whether that motivates policy on both parts. And my second question would be about the Scarborough Shoal incident, which, as I remember, was, as you said, that the Chinese came in and tried to prevent Filipinos from fishing there or something like that. And then the Filipinos tried to occupy it. And then there was some sort of a negotiation that sort of failed, and it ended up with the Chinese having more ships there. And I don't know if the Filipinos had anybody left there. And my question is, should the United States at that point have done something, and why didn't it do something about that? Since, as you said, that's our ally, and we had a principle that the State Department legal people had decided that our treaty with them obligated us to get involved in certain scenarios that sounded like that was one of those scenarios.
Two short and simple questions.
Yeah,
Both of which are covered extensively in the book.
are they really?
Well,
Buy the book.
they are you should have buy two, buy three, give them to your loved ones. I've got a kid to put through college eventually. So I would suggest that today, the reason that the US is most likely to think about the South China Sea is its relation to a Taiwan crisis. And kind of relatedly, its relationship to the Philippine alliance, because you can't really win a Taiwan crisis today without access to the Philippines, which you currently don't have, and you won't get without a credible treaty commitment. But I don't think that that is as good a motivating explanation for the US historically, nor does it explain Chinese behavior. So I've got a section in the conclusion where I kind of take up alternative arguments about the South China Sea, that it's all about oil and gas, it's all about fishing, it's all about A2AD capabilities in the case of China. And the argument I would make is that each of those are true, but they don't provide a full picture of, right? So they're each true of individual stakeholders within the Chinese state. I mean, the PLA Navy has had an explicit strategy there for all of us to read since at least 1984, that the primary mission of the Chinese Navy is to deny access within the first island chain to an adversary and to contest access in the second island chain. That is the primary goal, and the South China Sea is key to that. But if that was the only goal, why would they spend so much time kicking around Filipino fishermen? Why would they spend so much time harassing Vietnamese oil and gas operations? Why would they have done all the things for more than a decade now that essentially drove very hesitant Southeast Asian partners into closer military ties with first Obama, then Trump, and now Biden, which clearly cut against the broader US, Chinese strategic interest in pushing the Americans out of the region? The economic explanations are even weaker for a lot of reasons. I think fundamentally, this is about sovereignty. It's about the stories that nations tell themselves, and the Chinese government has told itself a fairy tale. It doesn't matter if China actually was first to claim or occupy the islands. It doesn't matter if the 9-dash line is a cartographic error by a guy who wasn't even a certified geographer in 1935, which is also detailed in the book. What matters is that Chinese school children have been taught that James Shoal is the southernmost piece of Chinese territory for 100 years, and that has become particularly salient in the post-Tiananmen patriotic education campaign. And that under Xi, the retaking of maritime territory has been a fundamental component of the China dream since at least his first major speech on the issue in mid-2013. And so I think there's far greater political salience to the South China Sea issue that would remain if Taiwan fell peacefully into the lap of Beijing tomorrow. It wouldn't solve the disputes, nor would it prevent China from continuing to threaten the lives of Southeast Asian operators. Now, I will say that for the US, if you look at the South China Sea today, I mean, let's not even look at the South China Sea. Look at Speaker Pelosi going to Taipei. When Speaker Pelosi left Kuala Lumpur on her way to Taipei, her US military plane flew around the Philippines instead of taking the direct route from KL to Taipei. Why? Because they cannot guarantee her safety flying over the South China Sea. That is a very clear crystallization of the way that China's island building campaign, paired with its naval modernization, has fundamentally upended the long-standing status quo in the South China Sea. In the third Taiwan Strait crisis, we famously drove an aircraft carrier from Bahrain up through the South China Sea and transited the Taiwan Strait. We would be lunatics to try to do that again in a Taiwan crisis. China has advantages on every domain except for undersea in the South China Sea, which means that the lack of US access to the South China Sea in a crisis has clear implications for the ability to come to the defense of Taipei. On the question of Scarborough, so what happened at Scarborough is that you had a very specific Chinese maritime militia unit based in Tanmen village in Hainan, which had been heavily subsidized since 1985 to fish regularly at Scarborough Shoal as a way to show Chinese sovereignty. So by 2012, you had what was probably the third generation of Tanmen fishermen who only operated around Scarborough Shoal several times a year without actually making a profit because they were paid to do so by the Chinese state. In 2012, the Philippines got word that some of these Tanmen fishermen were poaching endangered species, among other things, and they deployed what was the closest asset they had, unfortunately, their naval flagship, the former USS Hamilton, US Hamilton class cutter. They did board the vessel. They confirmed that there was a bunch of shark fins and endangered turtles on board. Before they could actually arrest the fishermen, the Chinese Coast Guard, or at that time, actually the Fisheries Law Enforcement Command, the predecessor, showed up, blocked the only entrance to the shoal where you can get in or out of the lagoon, and you had a standoff. That standoff went on for about 3 months. There were more boats, less boats. At every moment, the Chinese outnumbered the Filipinos 10-1, particularly the maritime militia vessels who kept showing up in greater and greater numbers. At that time, Fu Ying, who was the I think head of the Foreign Affairs Commission of the National People's Congress, was visiting, oh no, sorry, she was not that yet. She was in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs still. She was visiting DC. Kurt Campbell, then the Assistant Secretary of State for Asia, organized a quiet meeting with her at a hotel in Northern Virginia, at which the two tried to diffuse this crisis around Scarborough Shoal, partially at the insistence of the Aquino government in Manila. Kurt would say that Fu Ying agreed that if the Filipinos pulled out, the Chinese would pull out and everybody would go back to the status quo ante. In Fu Ying's memoir, she writes that she told Kurt, "I'll see what we can do." And
she denies that. She denies that she made it.
That's right.
She read a report.
Yeah. Yeah, her memoir essentially says that Kurt said, "Would you do this?" She said, "I can't make that decision. I don't see why we wouldn't," and then left the room. And even among the American delegation, a lot of them said that they thought Kurt was hearing what he wanted to hear. Now, the problem with all of this is that there's only one person who's gone on the record about what happened in that room, and that's Fu Ying. Fu Ying is also the only person who was directly negotiating with the Philippine government, and the only person who was negotiating in a separate track one negotiation that Senator Antonio Trillanes had been doing as a back channel to Beijing. So there were 3 sets of negotiations with 3 different American and Filipino negotiators and 1 Chinese negotiator. And Fu Ying is the only one who knows what she said to each group. Whether or not she lied, I'm sure she knows exactly what each of those groups thought they heard in those meetings and played that to maximum advantage. But why would she tell? She has no incentive to tell us what really happened. So the bottom line is the Filipinos lost control of Scarborough Shoal. The Americans lost the narrative battle in the Philippines by failing to respond adequately. We looked either incompetent or untrustworthy, depending on how you look at it from the Philippine perspective. And the failure to invoke an Article 5 commitment in 2012 continues to haunt the alliance to this day, particularly because a year later, President Obama went to Tokyo, explicitly said that the Senkakus are covered by Article 4 of the US-Japan Treaty, and then flew to Manila a couple months later and refused to say the same thing about the South China Sea.
So what we should have done what?
What we should have done was, 1, we should not have tried to negotiate a complicated historical sovereignty dispute that we didn't understand. It didn't help anybody. 2, we should have been far more forthcoming that should the Filipinos have chosen to engage in whatever they wanted to retake the shoal, it's their territory, the US would have considered Article 5 to be in effect. And the fact that we did that for the Japanese and didn't do it for the Filipinos, even though Scarborough Shoal used to be US territory and the Senkakus weren't, was a pretty clear indication to the Filipinos that they're second-class allies.
So could I blame the Philippines for not, in fact, triggering a war?
Yeah, look, the Filipinos say that it's all Kurt's fault. And the
Oh,
Americans will say that it's all the Philippines or Del Rosario's fault. Well,
Yeah, right.
it would be. And my position in the book is that there's plenty of blame to go around. It had the Filipinos actually modernized their forces after 95, as they said they would, that would have helped. But the fact is, the Americans screwed up, the Filipinos screwed up, but the blame primarily rests with China. You don't blame the victim.
Can I go?
Please, I could see you're jumping to get into the
I wonder how many notes he
conversation.
has over there.
I have lots of notes, but I won't. So, I think the problem is a little bit more difficult than you allow, from the US foreign policy perspective. But the first thing I appreciate is when you said it can't just be about the US Navy. I really do believe that the freedom of navigation discussions by the United States are really about the military. There's a lot of people testify in the Hill and they say $5 trillion of trade go through the South China Sea. We can't have China blocking the trade. I've never seen any evidence that China would ever have any incentive to block trade through the South China Sea, since the bulk of it's going to China. Why would they ever cut off their own sea lines? So it's really about where the US military can operate without being harassed or being attacked. And that's why I think freedom of navigation operations are generally done the appropriate way, which is just to show up with American military assets. You don't have to do anything too aggressive. You just have to show that you can be there. You don't have to be provocative. We can be there. You can't stop us. You have no rights to stop us. And I think that those are appropriate. So I think that's the piece on the freedom of navigation that's probably most important. Maybe not back in the 19th century when we're trying to protect merchants. But there is this problem that the United States has a global policy. And when I was in the State Department, we ran into this long before all this stuff was famous. We knew this was heading in a bad direction. But we have a global policy of neutrality on maritime sovereignty disputes. That applies to the Senkakus. That applies to all of the Philippine islands that are disputed, including Scarborough Shoal, including Second Thomas Shoal. I'll get there in a second. And it makes it very difficult for us to make any other kind of claim. President Obama wasn't the first to do it. It was, I was in the Bush administration. We made it very clear that Article 5 of the US-Japan defense agreement applies to the Senkakus. But that was always considered special because the US did control the Senkakus. And the US did turn the Senkakus over to the Japanese as part of the Okinawa reversion. And as such, we couldn't really deny administrative control. And the alliance talks about administrative control, not sovereignty. But the US has never taken a position on Senkaku sovereignty. It has never taken a position on Scarborough Shoal sovereignty. And it doesn't take any position on Second Thomas Shoal sovereignty. And you're right about the alliance, but I thought you were saying the implication is that Article 5 applies to the islands when you talked about the Philippines, but it really doesn't. It's really about Navy ships and government ships, all Philippine government ships. And the Second Thomas Shoal is a huge problem now. I think it's an enormous headache for everybody. I think it's unfortunate. If it ever comes to blows between the United States and China, it will go down 100 years later as like one of these great mysteries, bigger than the Archduke. In that it's an active Navy ship. That's the problem. The Philippines claim that that's a ship at sea. It's stuck on a shoal. They put it there almost certainly on purpose. About a week after the United States blew up the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, the U.S. was a little bit, China was a little bit distracted at the time. But they claim it's an active Navy ship. So the U.S. is obliged under the treaty to protect the ship, but not the shoal. And that's, I don't know how to change that. And I faced it myself because back in 2006, 2007, there were a lot of U.S. energy companies that were interested in the South China Sea. And China wasn't happy about it. I can't go into any more detail than that. And what can you do about it? And it was frustrating because we have this global policy that if we changed in East Asia would change a lot of things around the world, which is that we take no position on maritime sovereignty disputes. On sovereignty, we only insist on claims that are made in accordance with international law, and the rights and privileges that flow from those claims have to be consistent with UNCLOS. That's a position. I don't know how we change that for Second Thomas Shoal with that, or no, Scarborough Shoal.
Yeah.
Without changing everything.
Yeah.
Like, why would that be the one exception? And I don't say that like, I don't want to sound too defensive, but it's an enormous problem for actual policymakers. Enormous problem. I don't know what the answer is. I agree with you about the description, particularly after the 2016 ruling, that China's behavior seems inconsistent with or in violation. And, one of those two in various places in the South China Sea. And it appears that they're claiming the whole South China Sea is a lake. And it appears now to me that they're claiming that the Spratlys are going to have straight baselines because they're behaving in ways that go beyond the 9-dash line. They're behaving in ways toward Indonesia that suggest they're seeing straight baselines in the Spratlys that project an EEZ into Indonesian waters that are beyond the 9-dash line. And they did inherit the 9-dash line from the ROC. It was 11. Actually. I know why 11 and 9. That's a kind of trivia question that I'll never figure out. Why did the ROC have 11 and why does China have 9? There's probably some.
Two disappeared with an agreement with Vietnam.
Yeah.
Right.
But why 11 in the first place?
Yeah, why 11 in the first place? I don't.
Actually, the story of that line, you said 1935. I think Bill Hayton in his book says 1946, but I always imagined Chiang Kai-shek calling somebody up and saying, "What are the boundaries of China?" And some guy down, at the other end of the phone saying, "Oh shit, boss wants enough." Yeah, and sort of drawing the damn line 11 because he had a map that was that big, and he, is that how that goes, or is there more to it?
It's like you said, it's really instilled because I remember my first trip to China was '87, and I went to the Xinhua bookstore and I bought a map of China so I could study all the names on my dormitory wall, right? And then there's this box, like they have the map, right? And then there's this box. And it shows the South China Sea that had the line. And that was back then. It wasn't even controversial really back then.
So why did whoever drew it draw it?
Yeah. So let me work backwards.
There's a lot there for you, Greg.
Yeah. So the then 11-dash line, which was originally a solid line, and then it got its dashes, you're actually pretty close. So in 1929, at the order of Chiang Kai-shek, the Republic of China set up what was called the Republic of China Land and Water Commission. Land and Water Border Commission. Most of their time was spent trying to figure out like what the hell all these treaties meant that they were forced to sign with Tsarist Russia and stuff. And then in the wake of, among other things, the French annexations in Spratlys, they really got to work on the South China Sea. And they had no navy, they had no survey fleet, right? So they didn't know what the heck was down there. They had this record that the Qing dynasty had annexed Paracels. They knew that, and the Paracels at the time they were still called Xisha, and Dongsha was Prauta. So you have west and east sand, and then what we now call Macclesfield Bank, these underwater reefs, were called Nansha, southern sand. And they decided at the time that should be the southern limit of China's claims. But they also had what was then the Sabatoli, just the transliteration of the word Spratly, which they eventually renamed Tuansha, the dangerous reef. And they put it on the map. They put it on the map alongside various islands off Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, with no cartographic indication they were claiming them. It was just a map of the South China Sea. The name of the map in Chinese can mean either China's South Sea Islands or just the island south of China. And it's very clear that they just took British sailing charts and transliterated all the names. So all the names in the original 1935 map are the names of the British ships that first surveyed them or rammed onto them. James Shoal, today, Zhengmu. Zhengmu was the transliteration of the name James. Why would an ancient Chinese dynasty have called an island James Shoal? They didn't. It's named after the British captain saw it.
English was invented in China.
my
Many thousands of.
Yes. my favorite absurdity is to this. So most of them eventually got more patriotic names in 1947, and then there was another round of rewrites in 85. 85 is when they renamed Scarborough Shoal from Minjujiao, which means democracy reef, to Huangyan Dao because democracy reef was way too controversial. So it became Yellow Rock. But my favorite is Antelope Reef in the Paracels is still the Chinese name, the Chinese character for the animal antelope, except it's not named after an antelope. It's named after the HMS Antelope, a British ship that ran aground on it. And they didn't know that. So the same is true of Money Island, which is named for a director of the British East India Company. They use the word Jingdao, money, for it. All of that is to say the island, what eventually became the Nine National Line in 47, after this, so you get this map that just shows where the islands are. You get a Chinese official going down to the Spratlys in 46, and then in 47 they rediscover the map. And not only do they rediscover the map, they have students of a single geographer who is not named Bai Mei Chu. And here I'll give Bill credit because he's done more work after his book came out in 2014. Bai Mei Chu had published his own personal map that showed a solid line around the islands. That's where the 9-dash line comes from. It is what the 11-dash line. It is an act of absurdity where basically, yeah, people were scrambling to come up with ex post facto explanations for why they were claiming these things that no Chinese official had ever set foot in. I partially agree with you on the Fawn point. So I will say I find the trade explanation infuriating every time an article begins with the words the South China Sea through which $5.3 trillion trade passes. I get mad because one, it's a made up number. $5.3 trillion of trade doesn't pass through the South China Sea. That is, you might as well say 10 quadrillion. You're just picking a number out of thin air. There is no methodology behind that. Two, you're right. China would not close the Strait of Malacca. We would not close the Strait of Malacca. And if we did, my former colleague Bonnie Glazer did a pretty good study a few years ago that showed that the cost per tonnage to go around through the Sunda or Lombok Straits, or even all the way around Australia, should there be a full closure, is vastly overstated and would be relatively short-lived before prices adjusted. So the trade factor is not at play here. When it comes to UNCLOS itself, UNCLOS is a grand bargain between the maritime powers on one hand, which meant the US, the Soviets, and to a lesser degree, Japan, France, and the UK, what were called the P5 in the negotiations, and the G77, the developing world on the other. There's a whole lot of other compromise in there, but at its heart is a single compromise. The maritime powers would compromise on the 3-mile territorial sea, the long-standing Cannon-Shot rule. They would accept this new regime called the Exclusive Economic Zone and the Continental Shelf in exchange for guaranteed passage through international straits. That is the fundamental compromise that was made in the very opening stages of UNCLOS that allowed the negotiation to go through, because the US Navy would, and neither would the Soviets or the British, ever accept that they had to surface their nuclear submarines to go through the Strait of Malacca, or that had asked for permission to pass through any other international strait.
Including the Taiwan Strait.
And including the Taiwan Strait isn't actually a strait under international law because it's wider than 24 nautical miles. But yes, that is the fundamental bargain. And so any claim today that like the issue of military rights within the EEZ or transit through straits is a matter of debate is silly. It was the very first thing that was debated and decided. And so, yeah, at the whole core of this idea, modern idea of freedom of navigation is a concern about military, the naval capabilities of the US and others. So I do agree to that. But I also think the reason that you see state and especially DoD now switching away from the term FON and preferring the term freedom of the seas is because they want to reiterate that it's not just the US Navy's freedom, it's the freedom of other coastal states to engage in all their other lawful rights, because you can't have one without the other. It doesn't matter if we really have a direct national stake in the ability of the Philippines to drill at Reed Bank, but if you start to take away some of those rights, the whole regime unravels. Sorry, clarification on Article 5, you're absolutely right. Article 5, I'm sorry if I...
Yeah, but that's the key thing. Some people want us now to say Scarborough Shoal is Filipino, want us to say Second Thomas Shoal is Filipino. Now, Second Thomas Shoal is in the EEZ, so that one's easy. It's an underwater feature, carries no sovereignty, but there is that ship there, and there are people on the ship. It's people that cause conflicts. There's no people. It's pretty easy to manage.
Yeah, so most famously, Harry Harris has repeatedly on the record said that we should recognize Philippine sovereignty over Philippine occupied islands, and doesn't explain how you get away from like a fight with the Vietnamese if you do that. I don't
How did you
agree.
get over a fight with the State Department lawyers? Is what I-
Well, that's why Harry Harris was,
He's a fighter pilot, okay?
that's why he was Indo-PACOM, think, not Secretary of State. Second Thomas Shoal is Filipino. I mean, that is the official position of the US government since 2020, when the US government recognized all merits of the 2016 arbitral award. So it still doesn't mean we're going to go to war over the shoal, but it does mean that any Philippine personnel or public vessel attacked at the shoal, regardless of whether or not it's an active Navy vessel, triggers Article 5 obligations.
It is in the EEZ of the Philippines.
Yes.
It doesn't exist in international law. It is a submerged feature 24/7.
Yes.
So it has no sovereignty. So you can't say it is the Philippines or something, but it's in their EEZ, and so China has no claim. That's clear. But it is the fact that it's a commission ship that makes
The
it.
Philippines also has the only legal right to build artificial islands in its own EEZ. So if you want to argue that the Sierra Madre,
Mr. Freak is illegal.
yes, the position of the US. So I just end with this. I know we're going way. Scarborough Shoal, it was American. It was Filipino. We paid the Philippines rent for it repeatedly to use it as a bombing range for 30 years. It was Filipino until 2000. It was not disputed territory. Now, that said, my argument, which I think I make very clear in the book, is that you can't put the genie back in the bottle. That does the US no good at this point to try to retroactively clarify that Scarborough Shoal belonged to the Philippines, because what are we going to do? Blow up the Chinese vessels in it? So we screwed up in 2012, accept that and move forward.
Okay, we are getting a little bit close to the time. I'd like to move it just a little away.
Sorry,
From
Rick.
the
Oh my, there's an
Philippines.
audience.
If there are questions from the participants in the room, raise your hand. While we're on this issue of a map, I'm going to ask you about the part of the map that goes down into the Indonesia's Natuna Island EEZ, right? Indonesia and China have no disputes over territory, but the 9-dash line map goes into their EEZ. For the longest time, the Indonesians were asking China for clarification of what are the coordinates, what are the coordinates. And you in your book talk a lot about the Indonesian efforts under Hashim Jalal and others to have these workshops on the South China Sea, build confidence, etc. And the Indonesians always told me that they thought that even though China didn't respond, that it was not in China's interest to tick Indonesia off, right? And, you know, make it a target of this 9-dash line map, right? It's what, 100 miles away from Hainan. It's right there at the southernmost point. They could have very easily had somebody go and just kind of say it doesn't extend there, and it would have changed some of the political dynamics. Have you ever heard any debate on that from the Chinese side, or why they didn't accede to that?
So there is no such thing as debate on the Chinese side anymore. I mean, 10 years ago.
Anymore, but like 20 years ago when they first started all of this.
So there's no documentary evidence I've seen of China kind of explicitly carving out exceptions for the Indonesians, but they were very clearly careful. So the first time that I know of that Indonesia formally recognized that it had some kind of maritime dispute with China was in 1994 in reaction to illegal fishing, in which the Chinese pushed this idea of historic rights. But then they very quickly walked that back.
Right.
And then it didn't really come up again until 2009, when actually the most detailed of the notes verbal that was sent in reaction to China's 9-dash line came from the Indonesians, rejecting all of China's claims. The Indonesians just did the same thing 2 years ago. What is clear is that there's been a debate within Indonesia for the last 10 years about whether or not it is any longer in Jakarta's interest to maintain the fiction that it does not have a maritime dispute with China. Some very prominent officials, Habaso Rasono, I would point out, being one example, when he redid the Indonesian EEZ claim in 2017, clearly wants to be more explicit about this. I think we probably reached a turning point last year. China, for the first time in history, physically tried to block an Indonesian drilling operation within the Indonesian EEZ, and it went on for months.
Yep.
And it has clearly caused a change within the security establishment in Indonesia. That hasn't percolated into Kemlu and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the president yet, but I think there is a fundamental shift now in the Indonesian Navy and the Coast Guard, recognizing that China's not going to stop and that they're now in for the same kind of harassment that the Filipinos and Vietnamese have dealt with for decades.
Which they didn't expect.
And is that in China's interest? No,
No,
but
but
is
there it
China
goes.
any longer, I would say particularly nuanced about understanding its interest in South Asia? No.
Okay. All right. So before we have to close this, I want to make sure we got one question from the audience. We had a hand here.
Yeah, thanks. So just, in terms of increased latency, and Chinese, actions around inflows, as we see an increased confidence in the Chinese state, the re-election of President Xi, if pushback from the international community in the U.S. is not sufficient to dissuade China in the South China Sea, could we expect a new 9-dash line in, say, the East China Sea, or similar expansions into what was formally recognized as, agreed upon international waters?
I mean, we already have a Chinese extended continental shelf claim that extends essentially all the way to the limits of the Japanese territorial sea. You could certainly see a more aggressive Chinese pursuit of that claim. I would point out, if you're looking for a leading indicator this year, for the first time in, I think, 6 years, China built 3 new oil drilling platforms along the median line with Japan. They had put a pause on that for years. But I do think we should keep in mind that the South China Sea is unique, right? Because as I said, the South China Sea, I mean, it serves 2 purposes. Strategically, it's the southern anchor of the 9-dash line. It's kind of the weak underbelly for China. It makes a lot of sense to invest most there. 2, there is a unique narrative here that's been built up over decades that does not exist in other places. There are not, other than the Senkaku, there are not islands, all the way through the East China Sea that are particularly emotive for the Chinese populace. Nobody's standing up and waving a flag in elementary school, learning about Zhengwansha, an equivalent in the East China Sea. So I think you'll see kind of a general bad behavior, a higher risk tolerance, more forward leaning on all maritime and territorial disputes. But I wouldn't try to use kind of a cookie cutter to say what we see in the South China Sea, whether it's island building or militia behavior, or whatever, is going to apply anywhere else.
All right. Now the hands are coming up. Why don't we take the woman in the front, please? Yes.
Okay. First, please let me know if this question got answered during the conversation, because it's been a long day for me announcement. So from the new national security strategy, I think the White House said that we're not going to support Taiwan's independence, but we're going to support their defense if China's taking inaction or action. And it appears, and she just said that he's not going to give up the armed force against Taiwan. And then looks like the South Sea is going to be a security leverage for Beijing. So what are we going to do if Beijing decides to take action on Taiwan? Is there any strategy or any actions we're implementing?
Well, look, there's 3 people at this table who probably know Taiwan better than I do. And here I'll say, obviously, we have lots of strategies and contingencies, and even with the Russian war in Ukraine, I can't overstate the amount of energy in Washington right now going into Taiwan contingency planning. Where the South China Sea comes in, well, I'd point to a couple of things. I mentioned the kind of shift in power dynamics when it comes to the ability of the U.S. to at least freely operate in the South China Sea in a way that it has historically. One of the things that's led to is a recalculation of the importance of friendly geography, both Japan's Southwest Islands, but also northern Luzon and the Philippines. And so over the last 18 months, you have seen a renaissance in the U.S.-Philippine alliance, and an enormous amount of that energy is going into discussions about Filipino roles in a Taiwan contingency. Because if you can't freely operate in the South China Sea, the only place you can monitor and potentially target Chinese activity in the southern end of the Taiwan Strait is from the northern Philippines. The other thing I'd point out is that if what we mean by, Chinese action here matters. Are we talking about an amphibious assault? Are we talking about a blockade of the islands? Are we talking about a lightning strike on Pratas or Ituaba or Kinmen or Matsu, all of these would have very different consequences for the US. And my suggestion that anything short of an amphibious landing is not going to result in direct US military action. I mean, a blockade, we will work to try to block that blockade, but we're not going to start World War III over Ituaba.
Okay, and we
Just
had
like we didn't over the Scarborough Shoal.
different
right.
time though.
Scarborough Shoal.
All right, is this a quick question in the back?
Yeah, I mean, it was more focused on what the US has done recently, which was like I say, the maritime domain awareness and increased Coast Guard presence. So what are the right steps that we should be taking? Like is, and what has regional receptivity to these initiatives?
Necessary but insufficient. I think our investments in particularly remote sensing capabilities, unmanned platforms, big data processing and information sharing in the region, accelerated by the Maritime Security Initiative after FY 2016, but predating that have been enormously important. And you can't overstate how much this kind of like the first step here is for South Asian states to be able to monitor Chinese bad behavior. You can't respond to what you can't see. And right now, China is the only one that sees everything in the South China Sea. So that is all very important. Having now 2 Coast Guard cutters operating in the region, well, out of Guam and potentially more going, is nice for training. I mean, anybody who comes to me and says we're going to have the U.S. Coast Guard interdicting Chinese maritime militia vessels doesn't understand what the Coast Guard's budget looks like and doesn't understand.
It's also weird.
It's an odd suggestion, but so I do think all this is important. But no matter what, I mean, you could dump $1 trillion on navies and Coast Guards in the region tomorrow, and all you're doing is trading water. All of that, all the security assistance buys time. It keeps the Filipinos in particular in the game a little bit longer. What are we buying time for? I think mostly we're hoping that facts on the ground change. I mean, it's not the only crisis in the world that we are just trading water because we don't see a viable solution right now. And hopefully, Xi Jinping won't live forever. Maybe diplomacy will have a chance someday. It doesn't right now.
Okay, so I think we need to stop there. I fully agree with Tom. This was a fascinating, terrific, very rich discussion. We've all learned a lot. Please join me in thanking Greg Poling and go buy the book. It's great.
Buy several.
Buy several.
They make great stocking stuffers.
That's a big sign.
Thank you all for coming. Oh boy, that was fantastic.